those of you who don't know me. I teach U.S. history and public history here at Colorado Mesa University. And I'd like to start by thanking Colorado Mesa and Doctors Vince Paterino and Adam Rosenbaum for hosting, for organizing this Holocaust Awareness Series. So let me begin by saying that I am not Navajo. And I don't claim any special insight into the Navajo people or the Navajo culture. But I am a historian, trained in methods of historical research. And I want to be able to tell this story, this sensitive story, in a way that involves empathy, that involves some sensitivity, and that involves good historical methods of inquiry. And that's what I hope to do tonight. As a mentor once told me, it's not so important who tells the story, it's important that the story is told. And so that's where I'm aiming tonight. When I talk about the Long Walk, the Navajo Long Walk that takes place during the middle of the 19th century. This was one of the first experiments in confining an Indian people to a reservation. It's a failed experiment. It doesn't work. But at the same time, it elicits tremendous distress among the Navajo people to this day. And there are long-term physical ramifications for the Navajo community that they are still trying to deal with in present day. So let's begin with a very, very brief history of the Navajo people. And let me take the opportunity here to say that I will be referring to them in three different ways. Navajo, we're most familiar with. Dene, that's the self-referential term for the Navajo people, which translates to the people. So I'll be referring to them in any one of those three ways. The first point of contention here is, when did the Navajo people arrive into the American Southwest? We don't really know. We believe that it may have been, the generally accepted date is around maybe 1200 CE, Common Era. But again, that's a certain degree of speculation. For a very long time, anthropologists believe that the Navajo people didn't arrive into the American Southwest until just shortly before Spanish arrival, maybe 1500, migrating down from the Pacific Northwest region, perhaps into Canada. And they're looking at linguistic ties. They're looking at these migrations, looking at these linguistic roots. It might be that the Navajo people have been here since the post-Archaic Indians. There's evidence that they interacted with the Anasazi. The current-day Pueblo Indians who live along the Rio Grande Basin claim to be descended from the Anasazi, the ancestral Puebloans. It's possible that the Navajo people are as well. Certainly the Navajo people and the Pueblo Indian people have a long history of interaction. Not all of it positive. Various points in their histories, they have been enemies. Various points in their histories, they have been aligned militarily, culturally. They do share some cultural aspects, but there are also foundational differences. But at the same time, they've worked together. For example, during the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Pueblo people developed a consortium, a united front with the Navajo people and the Apache people to repel the Spanish from the area. And When reconquest occurred in 1692, many of the Pueblo people then fled, finding sanctuary with the Navajo, intermarrying and forming new clans. According to the Navajo creation story, the Dene have always been here. They originated here. In this fourth world, the glittering world, they travel through a series of worlds, 3 worlds. Their people are taking different forms. They are learning lessons in Hazon, this idea of harmony and balance from the holy people. And when they finally emerge in the fourth world, they come into this sacred land, Dainita, this land that's bordered by the 4 sacred peaks: Blanca Peak, Mount Taylor, the San Francisco Peaks, and Mount Hesperus. And here they are living by those lessons taught to them by the holy people. Now, Navajo anthropologists and Navajo historians are taking some middle ground here. They're willing to acknowledge these linguistic ties. They're willing to acknowledge that the Athabascan-speaking people, the Navajo people, they have some connection to Athabascan-speaking people, for example, in Oregon, in Northern California, the Upa people, for example. And they posit that there may have been multiple migration paths and relocations over time. And perhaps some clans were able to get here sooner than others. A much more flexible view. Regardless, the arrival of the Spanish changes life profoundly for the Navajo people. Profoundly. There had been earlier entradas or expeditions up north from New Spain proper into New Mexico, but generally speaking, these were conquistadors, accompanied by soldiers. They're looking for something specific, perhaps gold. They're not looking to settle. But this changes in 1598 with the arrival of Don Juan de Oñate. And he's bringing about 400 Spanish colonists with him. He declares himself governor of New Mexico, and they stay put for a while. At first, they don't even see the Navajo people. The Navajo people are living in their citadel amongst these 4 sacred peaks. They're pretty inaccessible. Instead, they begin to colonize the Pueblo people. These are the people that they interact with the most at first. But nevertheless, they are bringing livestock into the region. They're bringing sheep and goats and horses. There were no domesticated animals in North America, north of the Rio Grande, before the arrival of the Spanish. This changes life. Sheep, in particular, change life for the Navajo people. Sheep become a mainstay of their culture, and they become very, very good stockmen. Stockman, there is no gender neutral word for stockman. Actually, it's Navajo women who tend to gain social capital from owning sheep. And as their sheep flocks expand and as they are continuing to farm, they're also very good farmers. They are requiring more and more grazing land in particular. And this becomes a conflict as Spanish settlers also are looking for this grazing land. And by the way, here again, this conflicts with the creation story, which claims that sheep came to the Navajo people from the Holy Ones. With Mexican independence in 1821, we see Mexican settlers now. There are never large numbers of Spanish or Mexican settlers in New Mexico. Life is difficult for them, and they're very far away from Mexico City. For Mexican settlers, they are having to really kind of strike out on their own in some sense. They can't really count on things like the Mexican government or the Mexican army to sort of protect their interests in this region. So there are conflicts with Native American groups in New Mexico, but it's very localized. Right? There aren't national forces moving in and policing this area. One thing that is happening, though, is that a number of Navajo women and children, especially, if you happen to be out watching your flocks, they are being abducted. They're being sold into slavery. Sometimes they're brought in to Mexican homes to work as domestic servants. Sometimes they're sent down south into Mexico and sold as slaves. Sometimes they're sold to Comanche Indians, for example, as slaves. This is a huge point of contention for Navajo people. They're losing their women and children this way. There are also, let me be clear, the Navajo people are also raiding, right? They're swooping down from their citadel, right, within this four corners region. They're moving, especially young Navajo men, they're moving down into these Mexican settlements. They're stealing things like horses. Escalating tension. Right? It's increasing over time. And then we have a new sheriff in town. With the US-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848, we see the arrival then of US troops into the region. By 1846, there are American troops in New Mexico. And they're a lot more formidable, right, than any threat from the Mexican government. The Navajos are less than impressed. They see these American soldiers come and they're like, meh, we're still better than they are. But they do have better firepower than we do. They're impressed with that. But it doesn't really impact the Navajo way of life. And the American soldiers, the US soldiers, Colonel Stephen Kearny, for example, he wants to negotiate with the Navajo people this unconquered, self-sustaining Indian community. He wants to negotiate with them and try and cut down on some of this raiding. So he sends in Colonel Alexander Donovan, sends him into the Navajo Nation and says, see if you can work things out. And Donovan goes and talks to one of the very esteemed Navajo headmen leaders, Manuelcito. And Manuelcito says, well, let's talk about this. Sure, we'll curtail our raiding if you use your superior firepower to get back our abducted women and children. And Donovan says, sure, we'll do that. And in 1846, they signed the Treaty of Ojo del Oso. It is never ratified by Congress. In fact, the Navajos signed 9 treaties over time with the US government, only 2 of which are ever ratified by Congress. This is the first treaty. It is not ratified. And perhaps not surprisingly, the US Army is unable to return those captives to the Navajo people. We don't even know how many Navajo people are sent as slaves to the South. This is unknowable. There's no way the US Army has the means to do this. But for the Navajo, they see this as a broken promise. And so within the year, they have resumed raiding. Things continue to get worse. Tensions continue to escalate over time. And in 1849 then, there is another treaty signed. This is the first treaty to be ratified, the first of two. This is the 1849 agreement, the treaty with the Navajo tribe of Indians. You can see a little excerpt from that from the Library of Congress up here. And again, this is a treaty that's really designed to ask nicely for the Navajo people to cut down on their raiding. The Navajo people as well, they're tired of this kind of violence, and oftentimes these raids occur without sort of the whole Navajo community behind them. So there's also some impetus on the part of the Navajo people, many of the Navajo people, to also cut down on this raiding. And so alongside this treaty that they sign is a little codicil that says that the US government can build military installations then on Navajo land. And much to the Navajos' dismay then, by 1851, construction is completed on Fort Defiance. US military base, a fort, obviously, planted right in the middle of Navajo country. A symbol of conquest, staring the Navajos in the face. And the other thing that's really annoying about Fort Defiance is that it is sitting right in the middle of prime grazing land. Land claimed by Manuelito. Meanwhile, the US Army is grazing its livestock there. And this is a point of contention. And so these little hotspot incidences increasingly occur. Someone accuses someone else of stealing a horse. Shots get fired. An individual, a Navajo man, makes his way into Fort Defiance. He sees one of the soldiers' servants, shoots him dead. More conflict. Things ramp up to the point where on April 30th of 1860, Manuelito and his fellow leader Barboncito, and here I'm using their Spanish names. These Navajo leaders, sadly I cannot pronounce their Navajo names, but they combine forces and they lead quite a massive attack on Fort Defiance. They have a couple thousand Navajo soldiers with them. They are defeated. And the decision is made then amongst the army leaders and in Washington, D.C. now, these people need to be removed to a reservation. The reservation system is new. This is different from Indian removal of the 1830s, right? Now Congress has set aside monies to establish these lands specifically for certain Indian groups, these reservations. That occurs in 1851. So this is a very new thing. Wouldn't you know it, right around the corner, the United States is suddenly involved in a very serious war, the United States Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And so the US Civil War, of course, as we know, most of the battles are fought along the East Coast, really in the South. In the West, what tends to happen is that Union forces or Confederate forces, whomever happens to be occupying this territory at the moment, they're fighting Indians. For example, in present-day Arizona, forces are leading a genocidal campaign against the Apache Indians. there is an attempt to eradicate them. Here in northern New Mexico, we see this ethnic cleansing program undergo really through the efforts of Brigadier General James A. Carleton. And Carleton is determined then to remove the Navajo people to Fort Sumner in eastern central New Mexico, this very remote region, the Bosque Redondo. And so he sends in somebody you might be familiar with, Kit Carson, Colonel Christopher Kit Carson. He sends him in to initiate, to launch this brutal scorched earth campaign, starve the Navajos out. And Kit Carson's men go into the Navajo homelands, they burn peach orchards, they slaughter livestock, and they create devastation. And they bring the Navajo people to their knees. And the Navajo people are forced to surrender. And they're forced to surrender in quite a humiliating way. They're forced to go to Fort Defiance and surrender. And so eventually then, most of the Navajo people succumb to this scorched earth campaign. And in a series of marches over about a 3-year period, beginning in 1863, we see somewhere between 8,000 to 11,000 Navajo people marched to the Bosque Redondo. They're marched anywhere between 375 miles to 425 miles, depending on the route that they take. It's thought that there may have been as many as 53 individual marches over time, but by the end of 1864, most of the Navajo people now are confined to this new reservation in the Bosque Redondo. It doesn't go well. In fact, it is an utter failure. James A. Carleton was pretty committed to making this thing work. To his credit, it was mismanaged, but he tries. He doesn't get the nickname the Christian General for nothing. He wants to educate the Navajo children. He wants to assimilate the Navajo people. He wants to Americanize them. But he has so many things working against him. Rotten rations. And the soldiers they're dealing with the same thing. The rations are horrible. They're getting flour with plaster in it, for example. This is why we have Navajo fry bread today. True story. They had to fry it in order to make it edible. Maggot-infested meat. They were meant to be farmers. They couldn't farm. The soil was alkaline. The water from the Pecos River that borders the Bosque, brackish. Inadequate housing, severe weather, so many things conspiring against the success of this experiment. After 4 years, everybody knows it's not working. And so they send out a guy you might have heard of, William Tecumseh Sherman. General Sherman gets sent out to the Bosque Redondo. He meets with the Navajo headman, Barboncito. They hammer out some details, and the Navajos are allowed to return to their much reduced homeland in 1868. The Treaty of 1868, the second treaty ratified by Congress, and the last treaty ratified by Congress between the US government and the Navajo people. This is a little map I stole from the Smithsonian Institute, and you can see the original Navajo homeland. Pretty massive. Pretty massive. And here's Fort Defiance, almost right smack dab in the middle. And they would take these routes either over the mountains to Fort Sumner or in a southerly direction. Either way, what ended up happening during these marches is that most of the Navajo people were forced to walk. If you happen to be a pregnant woman or elderly or perhaps a small child, you might be able to ride in a wagon. Many Navajo people die along the way. We don't know how many. We'll never know how many. Sometimes U.S. soldiers some were kinder than others. They would stop and allow people to bury their dead. Sometimes they didn't. And here are a couple more maps. This shows you what they are allowed to return to after the Treaty of 1868 is signed. This is today's Navajo Nation here. This is the Hopi Reservation within the Navajo Nation lands, but this is the current configuration of the Navajo Nation. And then you can see that over time, it was enlarged. Late 19th century, and then significantly during the 1930s as well. So this is where this lecture gets pretty serious. A couple of things happen as a result of the Long Walk. About 40%, we estimate, there were probably about 16,000 Navajo people in total at the time of this experiment. We think about 40% of the Navajo population perished during the Long Walk and the following 4 years of captivity at the Bosque. So many things, again, conspiring to invite death onto this reservation. Disease, dysentery, scurvy. There's a reason these people were sent to the Bosque Redondo. It was thought that they would act as a buffer against Comanche attacks from the east. And so they're also being raided by Comanche people. And they're having their women and children abducted by Comanche Indians. Malnutrition, starvation, syphilis. They're dying of exposure. They're dying of heartbreak. So life was pretty terrible at the Bosque. It's also pretty terrible for a small group of Navajo people who managed to avoid capture. They hide out, they flee. They go to the westernmost, most remote regions of the Navajo homelands, and they stay there in hiding for about 4 years. We don't know how many people managed to hide out. We think it was a pretty small number, maybe under 1,000 people. But again, that's controversial. We have no way of knowing. We'll never know. And this map shows you this movement of the Navajo people during this period. This is the main group. They are relocated to the Bosque Redondo. These smaller groups are the ones who flee and hide out in these very remote regions during captivity. We have a situation here. We have a couple of things happen that can create something known as a genetic drift. Genetic drifts occur when a small group's population numbers are drastically diminished or when a small faction splinters off. When a small population's numbers are drastically diminished, this can create a genetic bottleneck. And when a small group splinters off, this can create a founder effect. Either of these things can result in a genetic drift. Both of these things happen as a result of the Long Walk. in layman's terms, and I am not a geneticist. I'm not a scientist. I had to wrap my thinking cap so tight to try and understand this stuff. I saw every elementary school video out there over and over to try and understand what the heck I was talking about here. Genetic drifts, events that change the allele frequency, reducing genetic variations within a population. Alleles, these matching genes, dominant or recessive, we inherit them from our parents. So think back to high school science, right? You have a dad with brown eyes. This is a dominant gene. You get one of his alleles. You have a mom with blue eyes. This is a recessive gene. You get one of hers. And because brown eyes are the dominant gene, you'll probably end up with brown eyes. If you have a dad with blue eyes and a mom with blue eyes, those are recessive genes. You inherit one each of those alleles. Because they're recessive genes, you'll probably have blue eyes. Any scientists out there? I'm sorry if I am making this so simple that it's just stupid. But here's the thing. This is a chance event. It occurs as a result of something unexpected happening. It's unlike natural selection. Right? These genetic variations occur that can be either positive or negative. There's no value added here. It's chance. It's random. But they can become fixed in successive generations. Genetic drifts are not uncommon. We believe that they happen somewhat frequently in human history. In larger populations, they tend to be less impactful. In smaller populations, they can have a far larger impact. Some scientists, for example, believe that a genetic drift occurred in early human evolution when groups of people began leaving Africa. And they speculate that there may have been a genetic bottleneck that occurred that explains why Europeans, for example, have far less genetic variation than Africans. But for the Navajo people, and again, this is controversial, and it's an uncomfortable subject. But for the Navajo people, geneticists believe that the Long Walk had devastating results. A genetic drift appears to have created an extraordinarily high incidence of rare heritable diseases among the Dene, particularly among those Navajo families from the western half of the Navajo Nation. Geneticists believe that they can trace this to the Long Walk. And I've listed some very, very serious genetic disorders here. All of these things are diagnosed during childhood. All of them are fatal. And here are some other statistics. You can see from these that the numbers look pretty grim. SCID on the Navajo Nation, 1 in 2,000. In the United States more generally, 1 in 50,000 to 100,000. That's a significant difference. This means, on average, here's the bottom line. A Navajo child is statistically more likely to be born with a genetic disease than another American. Here's what, in my tiny brain, this is what I think I understand about epigenetics. This is something we have to talk about because this is a new way of looking at genetic disorders. And very recently, geneticists, scientists began looking, for example, at the Dutch famine that occurs during World War II. The Dutch hunger winter, 1944 to 1945. This is when, tail end of the war, the Nazis, they're occupying the Netherlands, they cut off food supplies. And these people who were eating a relatively healthy amount of calories all of a sudden are going down to about 400 calories a day. 20,000 Dutch people die of starvation during this winter. But it's a weird event in a number of ways. For one thing, it's not prolonged. Like, as soon as this occupation ends, they have normal food again. It's a pretty short episode. And they kept very good records. And so scientists go back and look at this in 2013, and they're noticing some very interesting things. For example, women who were pregnant during this period, and maybe they were only pregnant for a very short duration during this particular period of famine. For example, maybe by the time they were, 3 months pregnant, they were already back to eating a normal diet. And so scientists wanted to look at this and say, well, how might that have affected these, some of these things that we assume to be genetically determined? And so what they found was, and it was very interesting, the impact of early life environmental conditions can sort of mimic this kind of genetic variation, right? So during the gestational period, the embryonic period, very early on, this can create decades down the road conditions that for many years everyone assumed were genetic in origin. So things like schizophrenia, diabetes, chronic heart disease. They're finding that in the children of these women who were pregnant during this brief period of time. And what's more, they're finding that those children's children can also carry that same sort of genetic variation. So this has both good and bad sort of implications, right? It's a very new science. They're just sort of starting to kind of figure out what this means. Environment is important. For the Navajo people, for example, we look at this disease that we always thought of as genetic retinoblastoma. This is a very serious but curable cancer. It's eye tumors in children. And they are finding that epigenetics plays a big role in this. Exposure to toxins, exposure to radiation, poor diets, and I'm talking really poor diets here. So again, possible multi-generational impact. I say this because this is kind of a game changer down the road. It's something that kind of needs to be said. But whether you're talking about genetics or whether you're talking about epigenetics, for many of the Navajo people, they're just not having it. They are rejecting this kind of research. I mean, think about this. The Navajo people have a long history of being poked and prodded and used unethically as research material. 100 years ago, during the height of the southwestern archaeological craze, when every archaeologist worth his salt went to the American Southwest, the saying was that every Navajo family was made up of a mother, a father, 2 children, and an anthropologist. And, they also have reason to be wary of U.S. government policy. So, as a response in 1996, the Navajo Tribal Council formed its Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board, and then in 2002, the council issued a moratorium on all genetic research and DNA testing within the Navajo Nation. And they list a number of reasons for that, and they're valid reasons. Concern over this mainstream science, these mainstream research methods, and their dissonance with Navajo epistemology, ways of knowing, traditional Dene values. They're wondering, why do we subject ourselves to this when there's no benefit? Why would we do that? They're concerned that some of this research could be used to determine ancestral origins and thusly endanger land claims. The Navajo have been fighting, like many Native American groups, to secure their land for 100 years or more. There's a fear of stigmatizing. For example, the name given to one of these genetic disorders, Navajo neurohepatopathy. That's a little stigmatizing, especially since now they've actually found this disease, this disorder in some Italian populations, for example. And here's a big one. They also are concerned about the unauthorized, unethical, and uninformed use of Navajo research subjects, in particular Navajo people living off the reservation, and the use of Navajo DNA through orphan tissues that for whatever reason have been stored in a lab, used without permission. In the Navajo worldview, there is an idea of synecdoche. Every single part of a human being, from your DNA to your hair follicles to your fingernails, every bit of a human being is sacred. Whether that part of you is attached to you at the moment or not. However, now there are a number of Navajo scientists, geneticists, that are, they're entering this field. And they are optimistic that there's a way forward, that there can be a meeting of minds, this meeting of Dene ways of knowing and mainstream Western science. And the Navajo people are beginning to reclaim their historical sovereignty as well as their physical sovereignty. For many, many generations, Navajo people didn't particularly want to talk about the Long Walk. It's very painful. And so non-Indian historians took up the slack, right? It's kind of what we do. Anglo historians like Lynn Bailey, David Lavender, Gerald Thompson, they've all written on this subject. They position Huelde, the Long Walk, as beneficial. They say, yes, it was an experiment, it was a harsh experiment, but look at how it benefited the Navajo people. They learned to use wagons, they learned silversmithing, they were introduced to modern farm tools. Ultimately, it brought the Navajo people into the modern world. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that Navajo narratives differ significantly. In one instance, for example, these mainstream historians like to say that allowing the Dene people to return to their homelands was a pragmatic decision. There was discussion at the time about sending them to Indian territory. It was like, oh, let them go back to their homelands. The Navajos, and I spoke to a Navajo gentleman, a Navajo artist about this a while back, and he said, that's not what happened. He said, here's what happened. Barboncito performed a ceremonial a rite called put bead in Coyote's mouth. It was very efficacious. It persuaded the army leaders to see things the Navajo way. More recently, in 2002, the former New Mexico State Senator Leonard Sosi managed to block a plan to use state funds to turn Kit Carson's Taos, New Mexico home into a museum and a state monument. Because Kit Carson is no hero to the Navajo people. And in fact, Sosi was describing him as sort of the mid-19th century US Army version of Slobodan Milosevic, the former Serbian president and war criminal. And in 2005, at the dedication of the Bosque Redondo Memorial, here we see the Navajo people cautiously welcoming this monument. They were asked for their input when this monument was being designed. In fact, a Navajo architect designed the building. And a community-wide invitation was sent out to the Navajo people to attend the opening ceremony. And many, many Navajo people came to this opening ceremony. And the New Mexico Senator Pete Domenici gave the key address. He got up in front of everyone. He began his politician speech. And a Dene woman in the audience literally made the Dene presence felt. She just cut him off. Nicole Walker. She and her family had walked 42 miles to this opening dedication in honor of her ancestors. And she got up in front of the crowd and she just started talking about her family's experience. During the long walk, she burst into tears. It was incredibly moving. The crowd went silent. She was controlling that narrative. And the Navajo people today, this site of conscience is still very important to them. I was there a while back. This little site up here, Navajo people still visit this memorial with great regularity. They bring rocks from all the different corners of the Navajo Nation. When I was there, there were a couple of purple hearts that Navajo Vietnam veterans had left, for example, on this stack of mementos. And the Navajo people are reclaiming this historical narrative, this historical sovereignty through art. The Navajo Nation poet laureate, Laura Toey, wrote a beautiful poem, here just 2 stanzas of it, called Returning. Other Navajo poets are also writing about the Long Walk. Navajo musicians are including these themes in their music. And I will leave you with this beautiful painting by Narciso Abeta. He was a World War II veteran, a Dene artist. He was a student at the Santa Fe Indian School during the 1930s. He was an explosives expert during World War II, and he was traumatized. And for decades after returning home, he couldn't paint because of PTSD. And it was only until he returned to these traditional themes and Navajo imagery that he was able to paint again and heal. The Navajo Nation today still has its challenges like every community. But it's doing well. It's the second largest Native American group, population-wise, about 350,000 Navajo people. The Navajo Nation has the largest land base, 17.3 million acres, a vibrant language, about 175,000 speakers of the, and I'm sure I'm going to see a lot of hands raised. Does anybody speak Navajo? Okay, well, I tried to learn. Not easy. One of the 6 most difficult languages. Some people think if you don't learn it as a child, you can't learn it. I would agree with that. So to sum up then, although the Long Walk remains a traumatic episode in Navajo history, its significance can't be relegated to the past. The Navajo people continue to confront these ongoing repercussions of this US government action, one that took place 150 years ago. But this is just the beginning of the story. There are other challenges to Navajo health and well-being: Cold War uranium mining, coal mines and the poisoning of the water table, COVID-19, generational trauma. All of these things continue to impact the Dene people disproportionately today. Is this a story of genocide? This is a story of survival. Thanks, everybody.